Chicago had no shortage of violent men. It had killers, enforcers, and bosses who ruled quietly and lived carefully. Sam DeStefano was different. He did not hide, he did not blend in. He made money for the mob, but he also drew attention they did not want. Federal agents watched him for years. Politicians took his money. Judges protected him. And still, everyone knew the same thing. One day, Sam DeStefano was going to be a problem that could not be fixed. This is the true story of how the Chicago outfit tolerated its most unstable asset, and why they ultimately decided he had to go. Samuel DeStefano Jr. was born on September 13, 1909, in Streator, Illinois. His parents, Samuel DeStefano Sr. and Rosalie Brasco DeStefano, were Italian immigrants who had arrived in the United States in 1903, part of a wave chasing industrial work and stability. His father labored for years before later working as a grocer and small real estate salesman. The family was large, 7 children in all, and money was always tight. Not long after Sam's birth, the family moved to Herrin, Illinois, where his father found work in the coal mines. Herrin was a hard town, defined by dangerous labor and bitter conflict, and Sam's earliest years unfolded against the backdrop of strikes, violence, and the lingering aftermath of the Herrin labor unrest. By the early 1920s, the DeStefano family moved again, this time north to Chicago's Little Italy. The neighborhood was crowded, poor, and tightly bound by ethnic loyalty and street-level power. It was also a place where young boys learned quickly how violence worked. Gangs controlled corners, older men enforced debts, and police presence was uneven at best. For a child growing up there, crime was not distant or abstract. It was visible, practical, and often rewarded. Sam DeStefano absorbed that lesson early. By his mid-teens, DeStefano was already known to local police. One of the earliest documented incidents came on September 12, 1926, when he was arrested in Chicago and turned over to the Niles Police Department as a fugitive who had escaped custody. The following year, his name appeared again when large groups of West Side gang members gathered outside a police station, threatening violence after DeStefano was arrested and one of his associates was shot during the confrontation. Even at that age, his arrests were already drawing attention and mobilizing street muscle. By the end of 1926, Sam DeStefano was no longer simply a troubled teenager drifting into crime. He was already moving inside a world where arrests were answered with intimidation, where loyalty was enforced publicly, and where consequences were negotiated rather than feared. The path ahead was not forming slowly, it was already set in motion. In 1927, Samuel DeStefano was 17 years old when he was convicted of a sexual assault in Cook County, Illinois. Court records show that the charge stemmed from an incident involving a teenage victim, and the case resulted in a guilty verdict. DeStefano was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The conviction removed him from the streets during a formative period of his life and placed him inside the state prison system before he reached adulthood. The sentence did not isolate him from criminal networks. Even at that age, DeStefano already had ties to West Side street groups that were willing to mobilize on his behalf. That same year, large numbers of gang members appeared outside a police station following one of his arrests, openly challenging law enforcement. The incident underscored that DeStefano was not operating as a lone offender. He was already part of a larger street structure built on loyalty, intimidation, and collective response. When DeStefano was released near the end of the decade, he returned to Chicago with prison time behind him and a reputation that carried weight in his neighborhood. He gravitated back to the West Side and formally aligned himself with the 42 Gang, a street organization centered in Chicago's Little Italy. The group was known for robberies, enforcement work, and producing future figures connected to the Chicago outfit. Membership offered protection, income, and a clear path forward in the city's criminal economy. By 1930, DeStefano's direction was no longer uncertain. His early conviction and time in prison had not altered his behavior. They had reinforced it. He had learned that authority could be resisted, that violence carried influence, and that affiliation offered insulation from consequences. The teenager who entered the system in 1927 emerged at the end of the decade as a committed gang member, moving steadily toward deeper involvement in organized crime. By the early 1930s, Samuel DeStefano's criminal activity had moved beyond street-level offenses and into more serious territory. In 1932, while involved in a grocery store robbery on Chicago's West Side, DeStefano was shot by a police officer. Later that same year, he appeared at a local hospital suffering from bullet wounds. He refused to explain how he had been injured, a pattern that would follow him throughout his life. The incident confirmed that he was now participating in crimes where firearms, police response, and the risk of death were routine parts of the job. In 1933, DeStefano's luck ran out. He was arrested and convicted for a bank robbery in New Lisbon, Wisconsin. The crime had ended chaotically, with the getaway car breaking down and the suspects fleeing into nearby woods. DeStefano was captured while attempting to escape and brought to trial. The court handed down a 40-year sentence, effectively removing him from the streets at a time when his criminal career was accelerating. He was sent to prison as a young man facing what appeared to be most of his adult life behind bars. Prison did not diminish DeStefano's standing in the criminal world. Instead, it reinforced his reputation. He was known inside the system as volatile, confrontational, and difficult to control. Rather than withdrawing or adapting to institutional discipline, he developed a reputation for erratic behavior and a refusal to submit to authority. Other inmates and guards alike recognized him as someone capable of sudden violence and unpredictable reactions. DeStefano remained incarcerated through much of the 1930s and into the early years of World War II. In December 1942, his sentence was commuted by Wisconsin Governor Julius Heil, and in December 1944, he was released from prison. By then, he had spent more than a decade moving in and out of institutions, learning how power functioned in confined environments and how fear could be used as leverage. When DeStefano walked out of prison in 1944, he was no longer simply a gang associate with ambition. He was a seasoned offender shaped by years of confinement, gun violence, and high-risk crime. The time behind bars had not broken him or slowed him down. It had prepared him for the next phase of his life, one that would place him closer than ever to the inner workings of organized crime in Chicago. Samuel DeStefano walked out of prison in December 1944 after his 40-year sentence for bank robbery was commuted by Wisconsin Governor Julius Heil. He was 35 years old and had already spent much of his adult life behind bars. The release did not mark a turning point towards stability. Within a few years, DeStefano was again involved in criminal activity, this time connected to the black market economy that had flourished during World War II. In June 1947, DeStefano was arrested and convicted for possessing counterfeit sugar ration stamps, a federal offense tied to wartime rationing fraud. The charge sent him back to prison, this time into the federal system. He was incarcerated at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, one of the most notorious prisons in the country. Unlike his earlier confinements, Leavenworth placed him in direct contact with higher-level organized crime figures rather than street-level offenders. While at Leavenworth, DeStefano crossed paths with Paul Ricker and Louis Campagna, two powerful members of the Chicago outfit. Ricker was a senior power broker within the organization, widely respected and feared, while Campagna was a trusted lieutenant with deep influence. These relationships mattered. DeStefano was not a made member of the outfit, and his behavior was already known to be erratic. Still, exposure to figures like Ricker and Campagna placed him within the orbit of Chicago's top criminal leadership. DeStefano was released later in 1947 and returned to Chicago with new connections and renewed confidence. He secured a civil service job as a garbage dump foreman, a position he obtained by concealing his criminal record. The city later discovered the omission but declined to prosecute, a decision that reflected the protection DeStefano had begun to enjoy. The combination of federal prison networking and quiet political insulation marked a shift in his career. By 1949, DeStefano was no longer simply a violent offender cycling through arrests. He had established relationships with influential outfit figures and learned how proximity to power could shield him from consequences. The time at Leavenworth did not reform him, it elevated him, setting the stage for his rise as a major earner in Chicago's criminal economy. DeStefano began investing money he had accumulated from earlier robberies into real estate. One of his most important purchases was a 24-unit apartment building. The rental income gave him something more valuable than cash alone. It gave him a clean source of money that could be explained, reported, and quietly distributed. That income became the foundation of a growing influence campaign across Chicago's political and legal landscape. By the early 1950s, DeStefano was using that money to cultivate relationships with aldermen, police officers, and court officials. Bribes were paid regularly, not as isolated favors, but as part of a system. Judges received financial incentives to reduce sentences or dismiss charges. Police officers were paid to overlook offenses or steer arrestees in DeStefano's direction. Politicians were kept friendly through steady contributions that discouraged scrutiny. The arrangement allowed DeStefano to operate with a sense of immunity that emboldened him. During this period, DeStefano began presenting himself as a fixer, someone who could make legal problems disappear for the right price. He openly claimed that there was no case in Chicago he could not influence. Fees varied depending on the charge, with minor cases costing hundreds of dollars and more serious charges reaching into the thousands. In at least one instance, he was credited with arranging the outcome of a first-degree murder case for a substantial payment. Corrupt officers would sometimes escort defendants directly to DeStefano's home, where terms were negotiated before any formal processing occurred. By the middle of the decade, DeStefano was no longer relying on violence alone to protect himself. He had learned how to buy insulation from consequences. Money, carefully laundered through legitimate assets, had become his primary weapon. The system he built in the early 1950s transformed him from a repeat offender into a protected operator, setting the stage for his rise as one of Chicago's most powerful and dangerous criminal figures. By the mid-1950s, Samuel DeStefano had become a major earner through loan sharking, a role that brought him closer to the center of Chicago's organized crime structure. His lending operation generated steady cash, and despite his reputation for instability, he was tolerated by senior figures because of the money he delivered. During this period, the Chicago outfit valued profit and control above all else, and DeStefano's usefulness outweighed growing concerns about his behavior. That balance was tested within his own family. DeStefano's younger brother, Michael DeStefano, had developed a serious drug addiction while working city jobs similar to Sam's. Drug use was viewed by organized crime leadership as a dangerous liability. It attracted law enforcement attention and created unpredictable behavior that could expose entire crews. According to multiple accounts in the record, outfit leadership determined that Michael's addiction posed a risk that could not be managed. The order that followed was direct. Samuel DeStefano and his brother Mario were instructed to eliminate Michael. The decision placed Sam in a position that forced him to choose between family and standing within the criminal organization he depended on. He complied. Michael DeStefano was killed and his body was later found in the trunk of a car. Police questioned Sam DeStefano, but no charges were filed. His political insulation and underworld connections once again proved effective. The killing carried lasting consequences beyond the immediate crime. Within the outfit, it demonstrated that DeStefano could be relied upon to follow orders without hesitation, even when the cost was personal. That compliance reinforced his value as an enforcer and earner. At the same time, it confirmed what many already suspected. DeStefano's capacity for violence was not restrained by loyalty, family bonds, or conventional limits. By the late 1950s, DeStefano's loan sharking business continued to expand, supported by outfit investment and protected by corrupt officials. The murder of his brother did not elevate him to full membership. He was still considered too unstable to be formally inducted. But the message was clear: as long as he produced money and followed orders, his behavior would be tolerated. The price of that tolerance had already been paid in blood. By the late 1950s, Samuel DeStefano had established himself as one of the most feared loan sharks in Chicago. His operation focused on what were known as juice loans, short-term loans issued at extreme interest rates, often reaching 20 to 25% per week. Unlike other lenders who preferred reliable borrowers, DeStefano deliberately sought out high-risk clients. These included gamblers, addicts, small-time criminals, and business owners already in financial trouble. Late payments were not a problem for him, they were an opportunity. DeStefano's approach separated him from other loan sharks. He enjoyed the leverage that came with default and built his business model around enforcement rather than repayment alone. Beneath his family home on North Sayre Avenue in Chicago's Galewood neighborhood, DeStefano constructed a soundproof basement room designed to keep what happened there from being heard above. While his wife and children lived their daily lives upstairs, debtors were brought below, out of sight and out of reach. Those who worked with DeStefano described the process as systematic. Debtors who failed to pay were summoned under false pretenses, restrained, and pressured to produce money. Some were held for extended periods while their families were contacted and forced to arrange payment. The goal was not only recovery of the debt, but demonstration. Fear traveled quickly through neighborhoods, and word of what awaited defaulters spread faster than any collector could. Despite his brutality, DeStefano remained useful to the Chicago outfit. He generated large amounts of cash, enough that senior figures like Sam Giancana and Tony Accardo invested their own money into his lending operation. Under normal circumstances, his behavior would have made him untouchable within the organization. He was unpredictable, emotionally volatile, and drew attention. But his earnings bought him tolerance. As long as the money flowed, concerns were set aside. Even so, unease grew among seasoned criminals. DeStefano's methods went beyond enforcement and into territory that disturbed those around him. Associates noted that he sometimes killed debtors who owed relatively small sums, using the deaths to frighten others into compliance. He cultivated a reputation intentionally, wearing distinctive clothing, giving personalized gifts to borrowers, and presenting himself as both benefactor and threat. Everything about the operation was designed to keep people off balance. By the early 1960s, DeStefano's loan sharking business was no longer just a source of income. It was an institution built on intimidation, secrecy, and controlled violence. It made him rich, protected him from scrutiny, and cemented his standing as a necessary problem within the outfit. At the same time, it ensured that when attention finally turned his way, it would come with consequences no amount of money could permanently delay. By the early 1960s, Samuel DeStefano's loan sharking operation had grown too large and too violent to avoid sustained law enforcement attention. Complaints from victims, whispers from within the underworld, and the sheer number of people ruined or frightened by his methods began to converge. Federal authorities, already focused on organized crime after the Appalachian Conference, increasingly viewed DeStefano as more than a neighborhood lender. He was seen as a destabilizing figure whose behavior crossed even criminal norms. One of the agents assigned to monitor him was FBI agent William F. Romer Jr., a Marine veteran and senior investigator with extensive experience targeting the Chicago outfit. Romer considered DeStefano uniquely dangerous and made repeated attempts to question him about mob activity, including the disappearance and deaths of debtors who had fallen behind on payments. These encounters quickly became infamous. DeStefano treated interviews as performances, responding with provocation, defiance, and deliberate attempts to unsettle the agents who visited his home. DeStefano's conduct during this period extended well beyond interviews. In court, he frequently attempted to represent himself, ignored procedure, and disrupted proceedings. He appeared in unconventional clothing, used amplification devices to address the court, and turned routine hearings into spectacles. Judges and attorneys struggled to manage him, while reporters took note of his increasingly erratic public behavior. The attention, rather than discouraging him, appeared to encourage further displays. Behind the scenes, the foundation of his protection was beginning to weaken. Informants within his circle, including collectors who had witnessed or participated in violent enforcement, began quietly cooperating with federal authorities. Some did so out of fear, others in hopes of leniency on unrelated charges. Their information did not lead to immediate arrests, but it provided law enforcement with a clearer picture of how DeStefano's operation functioned and who was involved. By the mid-1960s, DeStefano was no longer operating in obscurity. He was under active surveillance, known by name to federal agents, and increasingly viewed as a liability even by those who profited from his work. The attention did not slow him down. It made him louder, more reckless, and more convinced of his own immunity. The gap between how DeStefano saw himself and how the law now viewed him was closing fast. In 1963, the system Samuel DeStefano had built began to fracture from within. That year, he became embroiled in a dispute with Leo Foreman, a large and physically imposing man who worked as one of his loan collectors and handled money on his behalf. The relationship deteriorated after disagreements over funds and authority, culminating in a heated confrontation inside Foreman's office. Foreman forcibly removed DeStefano from the building, a public humiliation that DeStefano did not forget. For a man who ruled through fear and control, the incident was intolerable. In the weeks that followed, DeStefano went into hiding while plans were put in motion. Rather than acting immediately, he chose deception over direct retaliation. His brother Mario DeStefano, along with associates Tony Spilotro and Charles Grimaldi, reached out to Foreman and presented themselves as intermediaries. They told him that DeStefano wanted to put the dispute behind them and resolve the matter privately. The message was crafted to appeal to Foreman's sense of practicality and to lower his guard. On November 14, 1963, Foreman agreed to meet. He was lured first to Sam DeStefano's home and then driven to Mario DeStefano's residence under the pretense of discussing a new opportunity and settling outstanding issues. Once there, the situation turned fatal. Foreman was attacked, restrained, and killed. Those involved included Samuel DeStefano, his brother Mario, Tony Spilotro, and Charles Grimaldi. Foreman's body was later placed in the trunk of a car and abandoned, eventually discovered by authorities. At the time, the murder did not result in immediate arrests. DeStefano's political connections and reputation for intimidation again shielded him from consequences. But the Foreman killing proved different from earlier acts of violence. It involved multiple participants, left physical evidence behind, and weighed heavily on those who had taken part. Over the years that followed, law enforcement quietly revisited the case, preserving evidence and waiting for cooperation. The breakthrough came when Charles Grimaldi agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. His testimony, combined with forensic evidence recovered years later from Mario DeStefano's former home, led to indictments against Sam DeStefano, Mario DeStefano, and Tony Spilotro. For DeStefano, the Foreman murder marked the beginning of the end. The crime did not simply add to his record, it dismantled the protection he had relied on for decades and placed him on a collision course with both the courts and his own criminal allies. By the mid-1960s, Samuel DeStefano was no longer operating from the shadows. His name was appearing regularly in court records and news reports, often accompanied by accounts of disruptive and erratic behavior. In 1965, he was convicted on conspiracy charges and sentenced to a term of 3 to 5 years. The conviction reinforced what law enforcement already believed. DeStefano was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, both as a defendant and as a criminal figure, insulated by corruption. His courtroom appearances during this period drew almost as much attention as the charges themselves. DeStefano frequently demanded to represent himself, ignored legal advice, and treated proceedings as personal stages. He arrived in court dressed inappropriately, used amplification devices to speak over judges, and derailed hearings with rambling statements. Judges attempted to maintain order, but his behavior strained the patience of the court and complicated the defenses of anyone associated with him. Outside the courtroom, the pressure continued to mount. In 1972, DeStefano was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison for threatening the life of a witness, Charles Grimaldi, a former associate who had become a cooperating informant. The threat occurred in an elevator at the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago, a public setting that underscored DeStefano's belief that he remained untouchable. Later that same year, he was indicted on federal charges for illegal possession of firearms, adding to the growing list of cases closing in on him. Behind the scenes, the Foreman murder investigation was moving steadily forward. Evidence preserved from the original crime scene was re-examined, and Grimaldi's cooperation provided prosecutors with a first-hand account of what had happened in 1963. Indictments followed naming DeStefano, his brother Mario, and Tony Spilotro. As preparations for trial began, DeStefano's conduct only worsened. He repeated the same disruptive behavior that had marked earlier cases, drawing unwanted attention and threatening to undermine the defense strategies of his co-defendants. By the early 1970s, the consequences of DeStefano's public collapse were impossible to ignore. His legal problems were no longer isolated incidents that could be fixed or delayed. They were converging into a single high-profile prosecution tied to murder. His threats against witnesses, his inability to control himself in court, and his growing notoriety transformed him from a protected asset into a serious liability. The very system he had manipulated for years was closing in, and this time it was not willing to look the other way. By early 1973, Samuel DeStefano had become a problem that could no longer be managed. For years, his value to the Chicago outfit had rested on two things: the money he generated and his willingness to follow orders. Now both were being eclipsed by his behavior. The pending murder case tied to Leo Foreman, combined with DeStefano's increasingly erratic courtroom conduct, threatened to expose not only himself, but everyone connected to him. As preparations for trial moved forward, DeStefano showed no ability or desire to restrain himself. He continued to insist on representing himself, disrupted proceedings, and drew media attention wherever he appeared. His outbursts made it difficult for attorneys representing his co-defendants, including his brother Mario and Tony Spilotro, to mount coherent defenses. Motions were filed requesting that their trials be separated from DeStefano's, a rare step that underscored how damaging his presence had become. More troubling to outfit leadership was the risk that DeStefano might talk. His threats against witnesses, particularly Charles Grimaldi, had already resulted in additional prison time. His emotional instability combined with mounting legal pressure raised concerns that he could attempt to trade information for leniency or inadvertently reveal sensitive details through his behavior alone. For an organization built on silence and discipline, unpredictability was more dangerous than defiance. Senior figures within the Chicago outfit weighed the situation quietly. DeStefano was not a made member, and his independence had always placed him on the margins of the organization. With his earning power diminished and his legal exposure expanding, the calculation changed. Protecting him no longer served the interests of the group. Allowing him to continue posed a greater risk than removing him. The decision was made discreetly. According to multiple accounts, Chicago outfit leadership gave permission for DeStefano to be killed. The order was not framed as punishment, but as containment. It was a final assessment of a man who had outlived his usefulness and could no longer be controlled. For Samuel DeStefano, the protection that had shielded him for decades had quietly expired. On the morning of April 14, 1973, Samuel DeStefano's life came to an abrupt and violent end. He was at his home in the Galewood neighborhood of Chicago on the 1600 block of North Sayre Avenue when he was summoned to the garage for what he believed was a routine meeting. According to later accounts, DeStefano expected to speak with his brother Mario DeStefano and longtime associate Tony Spilotro about matters connected to the upcoming trial and the growing threat posed by government witnesses. What happened next unfolded quickly. As DeStefano stood inside the garage, he was shot with a shotgun at close range. He was struck in the chest and arm, injuries that proved immediately fatal. He died at the scene. Investigators believe the shots were fired by Tony Spilotro, with Mario DeStefano's involvement in arranging the meeting. No one present disputed that the killing bore the hallmarks of an internal execution rather than a robbery or personal dispute. Despite the notoriety of the victim, no one was ever convicted of Samuel DeStefano's murder. The case stalled amid silence, fear, and the absence of cooperative witnesses. The killing achieved its intended result. With DeStefano gone, the Foreman murder case lost its most volatile defendant, and the risk he posed to others diminished overnight. DeStefano was buried at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Law enforcement officers observed the funeral from a distance and noted the sparse turnout. Few mourners attended. Even within criminal circles, he had been widely feared and privately despised. There were no public tributes and no claims of loyalty. His death closed the chapter on a career defined by violence, corruption, and intimidation. In the end, Samuel DeStefano left behind no legacy of power or respect. He left court records, fearful witnesses, and a long list of victims. The system he had built protected him for decades, but when that protection vanished, it vanished completely.